morning. I'd like to thank Professor Krosnick from traveling all the way from Stanford to be with us today and to share his new state-level climate polling data with us. Since the 1990s, Professor Krosnick and the Stanford Political Psychology Research Group has been studying American public opinion about climate change and the dynamics of that opinion over a period of time. He's one of the leading experts on polling, and we're lucky to have him with us today. The House of Representatives is the people's house. We are supposed to represent our constituents. And what Dr. Krosnick's work shows us is a huge disconnect between what Americans think about climate change and how their representatives are voting in the Congress. In Congress, climate change, remarkably, has become a partisan issue. We see that the vast majority of Democrats accept the scientific consensus that climate change is real, and Democrats support the idea that we should do something to reduce these greenhouse gas emissions. But the vast majority of Republicans either deny the science or ignore it. The Republicans in the House of Representatives have voted 53 times last Congress to block action on climate change, and tomorrow even we're going to consider yet another bill in the Energy and Commerce Committee which would block EPA from setting carbon pollution standards for power plants. And of course the carbon pollution from power plants is the leading cause of the pollutants that cause greenhouse gases and climate change. Well, in fact, the House committee will not even hold a hearing to learn from the scientists about the facts of climate change. We know that the position taken by Republican members does not reflect the science. What Dr. Krosnick's polling shows is it does not even reflect their own constituents. Climate change, in fact, is not a partisan issue across the country. His study will show us that the vast majority of Americans, whether they're in red states or blue states, understand that climate change is a growing danger, and they support action to cut carbon pollution. So Americans are way ahead of their representatives in Congress. They understand we have a moral obligation to protect the environment and an economic opportunity to develop clean energy technologies for the future. Our job as their elected representatives should be to start listening to them. I thank the professor for being here, and I want to now recognize Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, the co-chair of the Bicameral Task Force on Climate Change.
Thank you, Congressman Waxman. As always, it is a joy and an inspiration to be able to work on this issue with you and your talented staff. And Professor Krosnick from your home state of California is really a remarkable witness that we have here today. His polling on climate change is nothing short of stunning. It shows clearly that the conspiracy of denial has failed, that America has seen through it, and as Chairman Waxman said, it's not red versus blue, it's red and blue together, seeing that climate change is real. States like Alabama coming in at 76%, Iowa 80%, Oklahoma 87%, Texas 84%. It is remarkable. So the question now before us is, can Congress, can democracy be made to work in support of those kind of numbers from the American public? Against the money, against the lobbyists, and against the influence of the special interests. What Professor Krosnick's polling shows is that this is now a test of Congress. Who do we represent? Are we a body and an institution that is of the people, by the people, and for the people? Or are we an institution that is of the polluters, by the polluters, and for the polluters? Because this polling makes absolutely clear where the people stand. So thank you, Professor Krosnick. Thank you, Chairman Waxman.
Dr. Krosnick would want to hear from you if you would go through your findings so that we can see them, hear about them, and then we'll have some questions for you.
Very good, thank you. It's a great privilege to be with you this morning. I thank you for the invitation, for your time. I want to walk you through a presentation that has 4 parts today. We'll begin by a very tiny, tiny droplet of political science to talk about the choices that elected representatives have, and this will connect with your introductory comments, of course. And then we'll talk about some hypotheses. Why might some states differ from other states in their opinions on this issue? And then I'll walk you through the state-by-state breakdown of our findings. And finally, I want to tell you something about Americans' perceptions of Americans' opinions, because you've highlighted in your introduction the fact that I think there may be some misunderstanding about where Americans stand on this issue. I actually have some scientific data to show you a little bit about why that might be happening. So I want to begin with either a confession or an apology, depending on how you want to think about it. I focus on your roles in particular, and think about Robert Dahl's writing. Robert Dahl's a political scientist at Yale University, and published a book called Democracy and Its Critics. And what he said is that for a democracy to work successfully, the public should shape government action. And in order for it to work, citizens have to have equal opportunities to learn about issues, equal opportunities to put issues on the government's agenda, and equal opportunities to determine what government policies are implemented. So how can all of this happen? Well, maybe a free press and the internet allows people to learn, but how do you, as representatives, then take into account the public's views? Well, voting's not so good, because if you win an election, you don't know exactly why you won and what mandate people are providing. You can get letters and phone calls and emails from people, but you don't know the degree to which they represent the full spectrum of opinions in your electorate. You can watch rallies that get organized on the lawn, but that's the people who attend. So in that situation, my colleagues and I have something to offer. Scientific survey research offers you an opportunity, if done well, to learn what your electorate actually thinks and wants. Now, as you know, there's, of course, a different view of democracy, the guardianship view, which says that issues are complicated, the public isn't necessarily up to forming opinions, and you should make wise decisions regardless of what the public thinks. But, of course, voting for unpopular legislation, even if it's the right way to go, is risky for re-election. So we have ways with our surveys to help you make decisions, and we have the potential to help democracy work well. But, and here's my confession and apology, we are not living up to this potential. And I'm here today to try to take a step in the direction of remedying that. Unfortunately, although we know how to conduct high-quality and accurate surveys, and best practice surveys are highly accurate, almost all of the surveys we do, whether it's by academics or by the news media or by commercial firms, are done at the national level. And you need to know about your constituents in states and districts. Of course, with one exception, almost no one comes to Washington elected to represent the entire country. So my profession has not been providing the information that you need, and today what I'd like to do is take a step toward remedying that problem by giving you insight into what Americans divided by states think. But I will also show you a method that could be applied to lots of issues, and I hope will be done in the future. So the issues we're going to talk about today, the opinions, fall into 3 categories. The first one is what I'll call the fundamentals. Has the planet been warming over time? Has the warming been caused by human action? And is this warming a problem or not? If Americans don't think it's been happening, or they don't think it's a problem, then obviously there's no reason to take steps. We will look at support for efforts in general, greenhouse gas emission limits, specific mechanisms for limiting those emissions, and we will look at the degree to which the public is engaged in this issue. Does the public know about it, and does the public care about it? So we'll go through each of these. So let's just pause for a moment and think, why might the states be different from each other? What is it that might cause them? Well, you've alluded to one already, which I'll get to in a second, but to begin, let's just think about temperature. I mean, there's some hot states in this country, and there's some cold states in this country. Maybe the warmer states are especially aware of the damage that extreme heat can do. If you live in a place where the temperature sometimes goes above 100 degrees, you watch people die as a result of that. Perhaps you're more sensitive to the issue than people who don't live in such places. On the other hand, people who live in chronically warm places have air conditioning, and they're used to adapting. Maybe they are less troubled by extreme heat. And you might even imagine that people who live in cold states would like the idea of mild winters. that the idea of fewer deaths by ice on highways might be an attractive idea. So that's one category of factors that might be influential, and we'll look at those. A second is economics. People who live in states where coal, oil, and natural gas are present in the economy might lead these folks to resist restrictions on those industries. And people may rationalize their economic interests by saying, well, we'd like to make sure our industry is not hurt, so we think probably the problem isn't happening in the first place. And last, there is politics, as you pointed to. Perhaps red states are more skeptical than blue states. So we will investigate these issues with survey data. All of the data I'm going to show you come from scientific random samples of U.S. adults. These were folks who were recruited by what's called random digit dialing. So interviewers call landlines and cell phones to invite people to participate in the polls. Some of these survey data were collected with telephone interviews. Others were done by internet data collection. The data are collected during the period 1997 to 2013. In each of these surveys, there are between 600 and 1,500 respondents. There are a total of 23 surveys that we're analyzing together. So the data I'm about to show you are on 22,000 Americans selected randomly over a period of time. Now, this is a description of the surveys. I'm not asking you to look at them, but there are a series of different factors. Who sponsored the survey is listed here. The firm that collected the data is listed here. Whether the interviews were done by random digit dial telephone or by the internet. Whether the survey was done during cold season, moderate season, or a hot season of the year, and so on. The statistical analysis that I'm going to do takes into account all of these factors, and for those who are interested in statistics, we're doing logistic regression here to produce values that estimate opinions in 2012 and 13 in each of the states separately. For those who are interested in the technical details, there'll be a memo online at the Stanford site this evening to read about it. So let me walk you through results. But before I show them to you, I just want to give you a glimpse of what you know already to be true on so many other issues. So here, for example, is a Gallup poll done in October last month, asking people about the Affordable Care Act, 44% approving, 47% opposed. A result like this does not help you much. It doesn't give you a strong signal one way or another. Similarly, the Pew Research Center in March of this year asked about making marijuana legal, 52-45, not a big split. Similarly, a Gallup organization survey in July asking about same-sex marriage, 54% in favor, 43% opposed. Again, not a huge difference. And lastly, an NBC Wall Street Journal poll from July of 2013 about government monitoring phone calls, 50% supporting and 44% opposed. These are typical results. We see America divided about equally on so many issues. Not so on climate change. Climate change is a very striking exception. We'll begin with the fundamentals. We're asking, has it been happening? Has it been caused by humans? And is it a problem? And I want to show you, first of all, our question wording to measure the first of these beliefs. My training for the last 25 years has been very much devoted to careful wording of questions and avoiding bias. So what you can see here is this question wording. You may have heard about the idea that the world's temperature may have been going up slowly over the past 100 years. What's your personal opinion on this? Do you think this probably has been happening, or do you think probably has not been happening? So if you think about variety across the states and how people might answer this question, this is what we find. I'll give you a moment to digest it. This is the percent of people who said they think it probably has been happening in answer to that question. And if you look over here on the right-hand side, in a sense, this is the summary that you need to see. And what it tells you is that the smallest majority saying they think it's been happening is 75%, sizably bigger than the other majorities that you saw just a moment ago on a variety of other issues. The smallest, the largest is 88%. We have data unavailable in just 2 states on this one, North Dakota and Wyoming, where we didn't have enough interviews with this question in order to be able to produce numbers. But every other state in the contiguous U.S. has a number. And as you can see, those numbers are very large. This is not a situation in which Americans are denying the existence of this problem in large numbers. Secondly, has it been caused by humans? If you look again on the right-hand side, the smallest majority is 65%. In not one state does a majority of citizens express skepticism about human responsibility for the causes. And if you look across, now each of these, the states that are light gray are the ones where we don't have enough interviews. And I should tell you, the darker the state, the greener the state. In a sense, the larger the majority endorsing human activity as a cause. So you can quickly scan the country and see where the greener states are. But even the less green states, like Oklahoma and Texas, are at 72%, for example, endorsing human activity as being responsible. When we asked about the seriousness of the problem in the future, these are the percentages of people who say a very or somewhat serious problem. The smallest this gets is 58%. Again, not a single state saying that in a majority that this is not at least somewhat of a serious problem for the future. Yes, Rhode Island, 94%. Up at the top end there. Oops, sorry. Now, so those are the fundamentals. What about government effort? Should government take steps? So first of all, should government limit greenhouse gas emissions by businesses? This is going to get a little monotonous for you because it's the same basic result yet again. 67% is the smallest majority, goes up to 88%. There is clearly widespread support for this action. When we get more specific about power plants' greenhouse gas emissions, asking should the government limit emissions by power plants, again, the smallest majority, 62%, ranges up to 90%. In no state in the country does a majority object to this. You might find some interesting numbers at the high end. West Virginia at 85%, Arizona at 81%, Texas at 79%, Idaho at 84%. Should government provide assistance and encouragement to power companies to generate more electricity from sun, wind, and water? These majorities range from 63% up to 86%. Very general statement. Should government do more than it is now on the issue of climate change? For the first time, we see an instance in which a majority says no. In fact, most of those people say what's being done now is adequate. So we start to see a little cluster of states here. Montana at 48, Idaho at 45, Nevada at 47, and Utah at 46. Bear in mind, these are not states that are saying government should do nothing on this issue. It's just these are states where a bare majority of the state is saying government need not do more than it is doing now. But as you can see, in all of the other states, majorities are endorsing increased government action on the issue. Specific policy mechanisms. We asked about cap and trade. We educated our respondents by describing the way a cap and trade program would work. And what you can see is, again, majority endorsement. The smallest majority is 53%, goes up to 83%. When we asked about offering tax breaks to coal plants to implement carbon sequestration and limit emissions, the smallest majority at 55%, going up to 75%. Whether government should either require or encourage with tax breaks a series of efficiency measures, so these are essentially CAFE standards, being increased, the smallest majority at 62%, going up to 82%. This is increasing the efficiency standards for appliances. Same basic story, the smallest being 55%. So you can see we've gone through many maps here, almost no instances in which a majority are on the skeptical side. No instance in which a state is consistently on the skeptical side. Show you just a couple more of these. This is increasing requirements for buildings to be more energy efficient in use of electricity for heating and cooling and other resources as well. 62% is the smallest majority. As you know, one of the concerns that's been raised is perhaps we shouldn't take action now. We should wait for other countries to get on board with us because, let's face it, it's a worldwide problem and America would only hurt itself internationally and competitively if it takes steps alone, while, for example, China and India do not. Americans don't agree with that view. You can see that there is one state, Utah, at 48%, who are saying that the U.S. should take action regardless of what other countries do. And across a range of other states, majorities and large majorities say, go ahead, U.S., take the action, regardless of the actions of other large countries. There are a few policy mechanisms that Americans do not like, and we cannot find a single place that Americans do like them. One of them is tax breaks for building nuclear power plants. There are a few states that show a bare majority in support of government offering this encouragement. Most states do not consider them to be attractive in this way. And even less attractive are consumption taxes on gasoline, where we ask people, do you think, as, for example, some economists might recommend, if you want to get people to drive less, just jack up the cost of gasoline. Americans do not like the government doing that, simply to manipulate their behavior. We did not find a single state in which a majority endorsed that policy. Similarly, slapping taxes on electricity simply to induce people to use less of it is not popular either. For some reason, Californians and Coloradans are a little bit more positive than others, but they only get up to about 39% maximum. So this is not the case that Americans like every policy mechanism. There are some they do like, and there are some they do not. The last data I want to show you with regard to these maps has to do with engagement. Do Americans actually know anything about this issue? Should you pay any attention to what they have to say about it? Well, interestingly, it turns out you can ask people this question. You can give them a quiz and measure their knowledge that way. But you don't need to, because people actually have quite a good sense of how much they know on political issues. And what I'll show you here is the percent of Americans who say they have a lot or a moderate amount of knowledge on global warming. And you can see there are some states, for example, West Virginia here at the bottom, where only about a third of respondents said they felt they were relatively highly knowledgeable, but knowledge goes up considerably, up to about 70% according to these self-assessments. And you can see the darker states are the ones that are the more knowledgeable ones. There is no relationship between how much people say they know on the issue and the degree to which they endorse green opinions on the issue. Now, the last thing I want to show you is what we call the issue public in the U.S. So you can imagine that people who hold many of the opinions I've shown you, many of them may vote on the basis of the issue, and that therefore makes them particularly important in this regard. But what I'm showing you here are the percent of people who attach tremendous importance to each of these issues. These are, of course, well-known, long-standing, highly controversial issues that have been the focus of important policymaking. And so it might surprise you that at any given moment in time, as much as gun control has been on the radar screen of the federal government in recent months and years, only 17% of Americans attach tremendous importance to that issue. But these are people who literally wake up every morning and say, another day, another opportunity to influence government on gun control. So where does global warming fall in this list of priorities? Well, in fact, it falls right here in the middle. It is currently at 10% of Americans. And I'll show you here that over time, this is tracking our first measurement in 1997 to last year's. Our new measurement will be out in 3 weeks. Can't tell you about those results yet, but you'll see them shortly. But what we've seen is that there was an increase during the late part of the first decade of the century, up to relatively higher levels, and our most recent measurement of it was lower at 10%. Nonetheless, this is 29 million people who are prepared to do a lot on this issue, and this group is overwhelmingly green. They are between 80 and 90% green on this issue. The distribution of these people across the states is shown in this map. So the darker green states, for example, California, are the places where the largest fractions of people are focusing their votes on this issue. So there are some that you can see that are at 5 or 6%. These are not trivial, but they're not as large as some of these other numbers. So votes are most likely to be influenced in the darker green states by those folks. Okay, now, to wrap this up, let me just come back to my hypotheses. There's actually, looking at all these graphs and the maps, it makes it hard for you to envision what might be driving the differences between states. And what we found is the following. The first, we can predict greenness in a state using votes for Mr. Obama in the last election. So the more of a state voted for him, the greener the state is on these measures. But as you saw, and as you characterized earlier, it's not the case that states that voted majority for his opponent are on the skeptical side of the issue. Secondly, interestingly, summer temperature turns out to have an impact. People who live in states with warmer summers are more likely to believe that warming has been happening. But that's the only impact of temperature that we saw. And then there are two economic factors that play in. Maybe not surprising to you, the larger the fraction of the state's GDP that's attributable to fossil fuels, the less supportive people are of greenhouse gas emissions. They don't deny the existence of warming at a higher rate. They don't deny human cause at a higher rate, but they are reluctant for government to limit emissions. But here's the fascinating counter-finding, that there's another factor here. As you can imagine, the fossil fuel fraction of the GDP is related to but independent from the percent of employment in the state due to fossil fuels. And interestingly, the opposite effect happens there. The more people actually work in the fossil fuel industry in the state, the more they support limitations. So you can imagine these may be people who are actually breathing outputs from factories and would like to see less of that happening. So but the most important point I want you to walk away with here is these are all weak effects. There is almost no systematic variation across the states that are predictable based on the kinds of factors that our instincts might lead us to think would be dividing the country. Okay, my closing remarks here have to do with Americans' perceptions of Americans' opinions. So what I've just shown you might surprise you. You might think that these very large majorities don't really resonate with what you have perceived in the past or what others have perceived. And as it turns out, I'm going to show you here something that actually harks back to Senator Whitehouse's earlier remarks. So this is our 2012 survey, and when we asked people, has the Earth been heating up gradually over 100 years? In that survey, 73% of all Americans said so. There is, in fact, a partisan divide. 86% of Democrats said so, 71% of independents, and 57% of Republicans. So that's a 29 percentage point gap. But look at that 57%. It is not the case that even the majority of Republicans believe that the planet has not been heating up. But we also asked these survey respondents to guess these numbers. What percent of Americans, Republicans and Democrats, do you think hold this view? And what you can see, first of all, is that Americans vastly underestimate this first number. Although it's 73%, a clear majority, Americans think it's about 50-50. Furthermore, they significantly underestimate the percent of Democrats who believe in warming, and they even underestimate the percent of Republicans. So if you look at their perceptions, they think it's a 60-40 split between Republicans and Democrats, when in fact it's an 86-57 split between those groups. So there is a partisan gap. In fact, there is a partisan gap in perceptions, but people don't recognize that even Republicans are a majority on the green side of this issue. To close here, I'll just show you a couple of other quick findings. One argument against taking action is the notion that doing things to reduce global warming would cause there to be fewer jobs in the country or hurt the economy. Only 18% of Americans believe that, and only 20% of Americans believe that it would hurt the economy more generally. And when we talk about priorities, when we ask people what will be the most important problem facing the world in the future, if nothing is done to stop it, global warming comes in first place above all other problems. And furthermore, 76% of Americans say that you in the federal government should be devoting either a great deal or a lot of effort to addressing problems that will face the world in the future. And so it's not the case that the country feels you should focus on today's domestic problems only. So what conclusions can be reached? First of all, the vast majority of the states favor government action on climate change generally, to reduce emissions by businesses in particular, and even more specifically to reduce emissions by power plants, as well as to pass other specific emissions-reducing policies. In no state did we see a majority that was skeptical on this issue. And for elected representatives, this is good news, because so often, as I said earlier, you get mixed signals from the public. On this issue, you're not. You're getting clear signals from many different constituencies, and I hope this information is helpful to you. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you for your work and your presentation. I think we all believe that in some states where they produce energy, whether it's oil or coal, that they're very defensive, because certainly I see that with the representatives in the House from those regions. They seem to care more about the industries than they do about what is a majority, even in those states, of the public opinion of people. What do you think of the idea that perhaps there's a greater intensity on the economic issues than there is on the question of climate change? We see this a lot. We take opinion polls and see that majority may say one thing, but the minority that's against it has a stronger, more intense view. And because it's a more intense view, we politicians know that they'll be more likely to vote on that issue. How do you evaluate that?
Well, that actually is a phenomenon that Professor Dahl wrote extensively about, and we see it in our data as well. It is often the case that small minorities of passionate folks are loud enough and pressuring enough to communicate a real presence in the public that I think misleads legislators about their presence publicly. Nonetheless, even with our surveys, we see on some issues that the minority of passionate people may be the louder of that group at any given moment. And the good news here is that, on climate change, if you pay attention to the letters and phone calls and emails that you get, they may be 5-to-1 skeptical versus green. But the same thing could have happened in these data, or the passionate folks could have broken down about 50-50. You would have very little guidance of what to do, but that's not the case on this issue. On this issue, among the passionate people, they are overwhelmingly on the green side, which means if you want to be attentive to those who are really engaged, you're getting a strong signal. And those are, of course, the people who will be basing their votes in the future on that issue as well.
We've seen opinion polls that usually are in the context of a national view. If you added up all the states, do they reflect what those polls say nationally?
Well, the truth of the matter is we don't know. We are increasingly recognizing in recent years that if we want to predict the outcome of the presidential election, let's say in the next cycle, that we need to do a state-by-state set of surveys because there are just a few states that really matter, and we need good data in those states because the margin of victory is often very small. Our profession has not been in the habit of doing that. We certainly have not been in the habit of doing it for policy issues. Now, there is one exception in your state, our state. The Public Policy Institute of California is an example of a group that does regular surveys on substantive issues in California. So California legislators are unusually equipped to understand where the electorate stands on those issues. But that is not a model that's present in every state. So we don't have the strongest sense of public opinion in many states on many issues, and so that leaves me unable to really tell you whether the national polls reflect state opinions consistently. I will tell you this, though, that, as you know, Starbucks kind of looks the same in every state. And we are exposed more and more, thanks to the internet, to the same news media diet, to the same flow of advertising, to the same discussions that come out of this city and elsewhere. So if I had to make a prediction on the basis of no data at all, I would expect much more homogeneity across the country than I would variation. Certainly economic factors, regional factors will play a role. But my guess is on issues that involve the country as a whole, we'll see more unanimity than we will division.
And as you pointed out, we are voted into office by our state or our electoral region, not by a national vote, except for the president. Well, even the president has to have an electoral college victory. It's not a vote of all the people. When you take the strong support for Congress doing something about this issue and Congress not doing anything on it, except moving in the wrong direction in public votes in the House of Representatives, and you take maybe 3 or 4 other issues, passing the budget, dealing with the crime of mass shootings, and the issue of probably not choice, even though there's a lot of strong feelings about it, that seems to be a place where the Supreme Court has said there's only so far any state can go. But when Congress doesn't act on these major issues, do you think that is a reason why the support for Congress right now is hovering around 10 to 12%?
Well, I'll answer your question this way. We did a study that we released not long ago about what we call crossing the line. And here what I'm talking about is the idea that if an expert comes to testify before you and is before you on the basis of genuine expertise and offers opinions in that arena, then they've earned the ability to offer those opinions. But experts are sometimes induced to cross a line and express opinions on topics they don't actually have expertise on. So I'm a little reluctant to answer your question because it's not one that I've studied, but I will cite Professor Dahl, who I described to you at the beginning of my presentation, who does have an opinion.
Politics is exactly the opposite. Just so you know.
Thank you. That's why I'm here, I guess. What Professor Dahl raised is the idea of the guardianship model. That is, there may be some people in the House and Senate who think they have a better sense of what the country should do than their constituents do. And there is a long tradition of recognizing the technical complexities that might lead them to those judgments. At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, it's electorally risky because the public is watching. And what we do know is, to the extent that government does things the public doesn't like, the public does increase its disapproval of politicians. And so I do believe your hypothesis has merit, but I haven't personally tested it.
And then my last question to you is, in the House of Representatives, the people in control of this policy, by virtue of their being in the majority and being the chairs of the committees or the leadership in the House, have refused to even hear from the scientists and have ignored the public opinions, and therefore, out of a willful ignorance of the issue, have voted consistently to block any action to deal with it. Would you assume that effort is having no impact on public opinion whatsoever? They're not getting through to the American people that what they're doing on this issue is what they support.
Yes, well, certainly it's the case that the claims were made in 2009 that the American public turned away from this issue, partly having to do with the ClimateGate controversy where emails were hacked in the UK, and claims were made that the scientists were conspiring to suppress skeptical voices in their own community. What we see in our own data is a very small movement at that time in the American public. It was not easy to sway the public in their opinions, and that particular argument, as far as we can tell, had almost no impact at all on the public.
Well, you did show a drop in 2012. How would you explain that?
Well, in 2012, what we saw there is a drop in the percent of people who attached extremely high importance to the issue personally. And that, so the question is, well, what happened there? There were people who were married to the issue just a little time before, and they've abandoned it. And I would offer a hypothesis about that, which is precisely where your finger is pointing. That is, inaction in Washington makes it harder, after many years of efforts, for those green, passionate citizens to maintain their passion. At some point, it becomes dispiriting to watch the failures over time. So it may well be that the number of folks who retain that passion has shrunk due to inaction by government. But that's a guess, and we'll find out if that's true.
I find your presentation almost too good to be true. Why do you suppose that in states where we have an unremitting blockade of any kind of effort on climate change, and you show the kind of numbers that you show in those states? I mean, I'm from Rhode Island, so when I pay attention to my home state's polling, I'm seeing the kind of results that you show, and so it's fine, and it's not a problem for me. I've got to assume that my colleagues in their elections in their states are doing the same kind of polling, and are they seeing the same thing?
Well, that's a great question. I've actually asked many of your colleagues about the basis for their perceptions of their electorates, and they routinely have said, oh, we don't do any polling on that issue. We assume it's one that doesn't need polling because it's just not on the radar screen of Americans. So I think in many cases, people are not aware of the issue the way you may be with your own electorate. And, you could argue they should be spending their money to do that polling, but maybe I should be doing that as well, and up until now we haven't. So I'll take responsibility for making it more difficult for those folks to know. I will say...
The fact that you've assembled this polling data over several years, usually if somebody takes a poll, they go in on day one, and by day 2 or 3 or 4, depending on the size of the sample, they're done, and you've got a time window. And I don't know if that has statistical significance, that it's happening in a particular time window. You've now expanded your time window to maybe 5 or 6 years, if I remember the presentation. Does that affect the conclusions that you can draw from the sample?
Absolutely. So the data that I showed you are based on surveys going back to 1997, but we are statistically adjusting for those changes over time and opinions. So we're producing actually numbers that describe 2012 and 2013 using those data, knowing how opinions change slightly up and down over that time period.
Well, can't wait to get this information out. Hope it comes as an unpleasant surprise to some of my colleagues and causes them to revert their thinking a little bit. One of the things that I have seen in a variety of national polling is that the questions relating to climate change get different responses across different age groups. And if you get down to younger voters, a recent poll disclosed that even among Republican voters under 35, the majority of Republican voters under 35 look at climate deniers and would describe them as ignorant, out of touch, or crazy. That's a pretty rough indictment from your own party's young cohort. Can you look at your data and draw any conclusions about the age demographic and how it falls across different age cohorts?
Yes, and we've seen that relationship quite consistently in our data. The young adults are consistently more on the green side. They're more supportive of action. These are the folks who are going to be around long enough to see the biggest impacts among those alive today. And they are the most accepting of the existence of the problem, and they are also the most supportive of government action to address it.
And when you say you're polling as all adults, does that mean 21 and over? What's your age range?
18 and over. We'll
18 and over. So that 18 to 35-year-old cohort is well represented in there, and in your polling shows even higher numbers in terms of greenness than what the across-the-board sample shows.
That's exactly right. So if you think about the future of the prospects of political parties, those are the cohorts who control the purse strings in the future. And recognizing that they're even greener than the rest of the country is an important consideration, I think.
So if you're a Republican, you are not only out of step with your, if you're a denier, let me say that, you are not only out of step with your polity, but you have a demographic wave coming at you that is even more strong.
That's what our data suggests, yes.
Well, thank you. Representative Garcia, thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm in Key West.
This has to go over there.
My district is Key West, Florida, so we'll be the first to go if
The Florida archipelago.
yes. But what I find, and I've got a 50-50 district, I find that your numbers are about right. The only thing we have to be careful of is that everybody's for feeding children and saving puppy dogs, right? We know that. So as a general rule, as you go through your polling data, you always get this very positive response, which of course you were able to hedge back when you asked them if they're willing to pay more for gasoline. They immediately give you the practical response. But what I tend to find is that people, and I think we've looked at it, if you look at a lot of rural states, there's a lot of outdoorsmen and sportsmen who have a much keener link at seeing these things. And so in my district, very conservative fishermen and outdoors folks also seem to be linked, right? They're seeing it change. It's slight, but they're seeing it change. And of course, your data is from hotter states. You tend to believe it's hotter because we're always hot. So. But thank you for the data. I think it's very helpful, and I think it's a good warning to our colleagues on how to play it. Also, there's an interesting guy, Guy Harvey, which if you're involved in outdoors fishing and stuff, you know his artwork. And he's become very involved in this issue, and what he's using is country music as opposed to, because there's a higher propensity for country music to be outdoor folks, and they also tend to be conservative. But linking this global warming and the environmental issues to that has been fascinating, the impact that he's been having with these events. Thank you for doing this.
Well, if I can pick up on one issue that you raised, which I think is a very important one, are Americans actually willing to pay for interventions on this issue? It might seem easy for people to say, oh, sure, government should regulate as long as it doesn't cost me anything. But we find that the majority support does not drop substantially at all. It drops by a small amount when we tell people it'll cost them money and how much it might cost. In particular, we've asked a series of questions along these lines. If the government were to consider passing legislation that would reduce greenhouse gases by 85% by the year 2050, and it would cost your household an increase in the cost of what you buy of about $100 a year each year in the future, would you vote for this or would you vote against this? Now, I mentioned $100 as a price. Some respondents are asked about $100, others are asked about $150, others are asked about $200. And what we find is two things. The higher the price goes, the more people vote against it. You would expect that people are sensitive to price. Secondly, when you look at the percent of people who vote yes at each of the prices and add up all the money that people are saying they're willing to pay, it meets what the EPA has calculated to be the actual cost of a rather famous piece of legislation that proposed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 85% by 2050. So, in other words, Americans appear, when we talk directly about money, to be willing to pay that money that it would cost.
And you even pointed out people in states where there's a heavy amount of coal and a lot of the economy revolves around it, or oil in the economy is sustained by the oil industry, that they too understand that there's a problem and support efforts. Well, this is very, very helpful for us to get this data. I want to thank you for the work you've done and congratulate you and others that have worked with you on it. And we will try to get this information out to our colleagues so that they don't live in a world where they're not only denying the science, they're also denying the views of their own constituents. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you.